All right, let's move to some other issues. In the Australian newspaper today, Paul Kelly called it pandemic protectionism, where he rightly said premiers and chief ministers strut the stage as populist strongmen and women. They impose rules as they like, boast about enforcement and justify everything in the case of health protectionism for a grateful public. But of course, as we know, don't we, that they can only do this for as long as the federal government is picking up the tab, given that's where the lion's share of costs associated with this pandemic are being tallied. Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, joins me now from Sydney. Thank you for your time, Paul. That was an excellent piece in the Oz this morning, because you rightly highlighted that for premiers, let's put Victoria to one side, it's all care and no responsibility, really. They can lock up the state, they win the public over because they've been keeping infections low, and all the economic costs here and the devastation, really, it sits with the PM and the Treasurer, at least for the moment, to mop up, doesn't it?
Well, that's right, Peter. And as you say, I've called this pandemic protectionism. It's, if you like, a reversion to the old-fashioned Fortress Australia, only the forts are being built along state boundaries. I think this is a very, very detrimental step for the country. I recognise that some border closures are essential, such as between New South Wales and Victoria. But if you look at other border closures, I think the argument for them on purely health grounds is quite weak. And what we're seeing from a number of the premiers, particularly in Queensland and in Western Australia, is that they know they're on a political winner here, and they're running very, very hard on these border closures. And this is underwritten, as you've indicated, by the fiscal stimulus of the Morrison government, in particular by JobKeeper, which is keeping the economies afloat. And it means the border closures become much more acceptable in economic terms. The point to make is these policies at the end of the day are not going to be tenable. The answer to the virus is not permanent border closures. At some stage, the country has got to reopen, and that means we've got to learn how to live with the virus and keep the virus suppressed.
Yeah, look, we'll just pick up on that point. You talked about WA and Queensland. You made the point in the column today, and I think we were all trying to understand what the direction is. Are they pushing, do you think, now for elimination and politically expedient because they're states that almost are successionist anyway in their mindset? We've moved into elimination in those states, have we not? Suppression. And I think one of the issues is, you know, for all the national kumbaya we see at this national cabinet, there's no sense of the national plan. What does success look like? At what point, you know, Victoria to one side, at what point do we bring down some of these barriers and choose to get the economy back and live with this virus? At what point do we do that, Paul?
Well, I think that analysis is essentially correct. I mean, I think the National Cabinet has been a great idea, and I think it's been very successful. However, what we now see, I think very clearly, is that different states have different goals in terms of combating the virus. And a number of states are clearly running de facto elimination strategies, whereas New South Wales, Victoria and the Morrison government are running the long-established suppression strategy. So if the National Cabinet can't actually agree on the objective of the endpoint here in terms of combating the virus, then I think we're in some degree of difficulty. And frankly, that's where we are. Now, I understand that people...
Let me jump in there. Let's underscore for people at home too. We use the term National Cabinet. It's not National Cabinet in that everyone around the table, like normally in Cabinet, are bound by the decisions. They're not. The only thing that calls it Cabinet is that they are there and there's the usual rules of confidentiality. I mean, all the documents are Cabinet in confidence. But other than that, there's no common purpose when they leave the room. We saw that with schools, and now we're seeing it with borders.
Yes, well, that's right. Well, it's called a National Cabinet, and of course it comprises all the incumbent leaders, all the political leaders of the country, but it's different from the federal cabinet or from the cabinets that operate in each state, because those cabinets are one-party cabinets, they are one government cabinets, and they are bound by their sense of responsibility and commitment to their own policies. So this is a very different sort of cabinet. In that sense, it's an experiment. It's an innovation. I think that it was a very worthwhile initiative by the Prime Minister. I wouldn't write it off. I think it's important to keep it going. But what we are seeing at the moment, undoubtedly, Peter, is a lot of very significant strains and stresses in this arrangement.
How much of it's to do with the fact that there's an election in WA at the front end of next year? We know we've got one in October in Queensland.
Well, listen to what the Queensland Premier says. She says her main objective is to look after the health of Queenslanders, that she's going to run a hard border policy to protect the health of Queenslanders and ensure, and I'm paraphrasing now, of course, that they're not contaminated from the virus that exists in the southern states. So what sort of political appeal do you think that will be in Queensland in the run-up to an election? One of the arguments I made...
she's poll-driven too. She's poll-driven, so it's working. She wouldn't be still doing it if it wasn't working.
Well, of course it's working. And one of the arguments I made in my column this morning about pandemic protectionism, I said, one of the tests we'll see in the Northern Territory and in Queensland at the upcoming election is whether pandemic protectionism means that a government, regardless of how inept and incompetent it is, can be re-elected on the slogan of pandemic protectionism. That's what we'll see being tested at these upcoming elections.
And just quickly on China and this whole wine stoush, we know many of our ministers are not getting their calls returned. Do you think we'll be able to solve this?
Well, we're not talking to the Chinese. The Chinese won't speak to us. Our ministers want to speak to the Chinese, our agricultural minister, our trade minister, but there's no dialogue. So we remain in the deep freeze and the omens aren't good. The Chinese are now going to look and make an assessment about wine, and there's got to be a risk. This will lead to an increase in tariffs on Australian wine going into China. And clearly this is very disappointing because wine has been one of the success stories off the back of the free trade agreement between Australia and China. I don't think anyone in the government would have doubts at all. This is about politics.
All right, Paul Kelly, thank you as always for your time.
Thanks, Peter.